On May 13, 2026, Level 5, the developers of the video game franchise Yokai Watch, issued a statement via Twitter on the topic of piracy and illegal distribution, warning that it had observed quote-unquote unauthorized reproduction and distribution of our game software across certain online communities. Although the statement doesn't make clear what it's referencing, it is widely believed that Level 5 issued said statement in response to the May 10th announcement of an unofficial, fan-made, Spanish-language Unity Engine remake of Yokai Watch 2, which was allegedly playable on Switch, mobile, PC, and VR. And in response, the team behind the remake seems to have called it quits, and the project itself appears unlikely to continue given the veiled threat of legal action. This chain of events isn't that unusual, where a group of fans based in the Global West tries to release a remake of a beloved Japanese IP and receives a threat or takedown. In fact, this sort of thing is so common that I'm honestly a little surprised anyone is still out there trying to make these fan remakes. I mean, the oldest one that readily comes to mind is Chrono Resurrection, wherein Square Enix issued a takedown of a Chrono Trigger remake for the Nintendo 64 all the way back in 2004. More recently, there was the Streets of Rage remake, the another Metroid 2 remake, and we're not even getting to adjacent matters like fan games, such as Pokemon Uranium or Bloodborne PSX, or private server revivals like the Nier Reincarnation gacha debacle that occurred just a month prior in April of 2026. What's interesting to me then at least is not that another Japanese IP remake has been taken down, but the conversation surrounding these starkly different reactions to the situation that Western gamers have had in comparison to their Japanese counterparts. To Western gamers, the perspective is, well, we love Yokai Watch, and outside of emulation, which Level 5 considers illegal distribution, and remakes, which Level 5 considers unauthorized reproduction, there's no way for us to engage with this franchise. We want to give you our attention, time, and money. But if you cannot give us access, then so-called piracy is justified. To Japanese gamers, the perspective is, well, we love Yokai Watch, and when you use this intellectual property without authorization, you are violating the creator/company's rights. You injure and diminish the property, you steal income from the creator, and you make future Yokai Watch content less likely to occur. There's a seemingly unbridgeable divide here, right? To the Western gamer, the Japanese gamer's stance appears oddly pro-corporate and anti-consumer. Why stump for the company that withholds what it can readily provide? To the Japanese gamer, the Western gamer's stance appears oddly entitled and even anti-creator. Why must you have the right to play a game? Who are you exactly to demand entertainment and then steal said entertainment if you cannot have it otherwise? Don't you realize you're hurting the creator? How does one body of gamers end up so diametrically opposed to the other? Lazy punditry on both sides, mind you, will tell you that it's a cultural thing. Why, Western gamers are so individualistic and entitled, they think everything belongs to them. And the Japanese, why, they're so collectivist and blindly obedient, they just kowtow to their corporate overlords without a second thought. But this is simply not true. There are other areas in which the discourse is reversed. We won't get into it in depth, but ask Japanese gamers how they feel about censorship and localization when it comes to catering to Western fans, and you'll get a sense of how truly anti-corporate they can be. No, there's actually a rather sensible explanation for all of this, and it has to do with the legal environment surrounding intellectual property and the interaction of Japanese and Western fandoms with said legal environment, that thereby produces a certain set of incentives and outcomes. In other words, the difference is not that Western gamers are selfish and that Japanese gamers are obedient. The difference is that the respective fandoms have different legal incentive structures. And we'll take a look at how this is possible, first by observing Western IP law and the incentives it produces for gamers, and then comparing that to Japanese IP law and the very different fan culture it encourages, before contemplating whether, perhaps, there is some common ground to be found between preservation and permission. Or indeed whether these fandoms are truly doomed to endlessly fire cannons at each other from across the metaphorical high seas. I'm Mooney, I'm a lawyer, and this is Moon Channel. If you're interested, by the way, in literal high seas combat, or even, dare I say, littoral high seas combat, which I know is an oxymoron, why not check out this video's sponsor, World of Warships, which is, as of the release of this video, running its 8th collaboration with beloved shipgirl gacha game Azure Lane. Shipgirls and warships, shipgirls, why that's more ships than an amazing digital circus homestuck crossover Tumblr blog. With more than 650 historical ships available to play, spread across 13 different nations and separated into 5 different classes including destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines, you can surely find a vessel that will wet your steam whistle. You can check out the ongoing campaign too. There are 8 new commanders and 6 new Azure Lane themed ships to play with thrilling new missions and rewards to boot. Better yet, World of Warships is free to play, that's FTP, so there's no obligation to stay if you don't enjoy it, and every reason to give it a try. Just click on the link provided in the description and use my code AzureLaneWave8 to claim your starter pack. That's AZURLANEWAVE8 to claim your starter pack and get a sailin'. A special thanks then to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. To borrow Level 5's language here, quote-unquote, piracy and illegal distribution in the video game space is a pretty tricky topic to approach for most pundits. And I say borrow Level 5's language quite deliberately because the Yokai Watch fan remake was, well, a fan remake. It was not a ROM, it existed in a gray space between piracy and preservation, fan labor in an unauthorized derivative work. In order to preserve the context of Level 5's claims, we're going to stick with their terminology and when called for use the term piracy. Fair warning, okay? Now on the one hand, the unauthorized reproduction and distribution and/or piracy is, well, generally illegal, and in large part it's also anti-corporate interest. So if you're, say, a writer working for a large media company that covers video games, it is directly against your employer's incentives and thus your incentives to write anything positive about piracy. But amongst Western gamers at large, piracy is generally viewed rather favorably. You've heard the old adage, I'm sure, if a digital copy of a video game cannot be owned, only licensed, then pirating a game isn't theft. Well, that's not a very legally sound argument, given that video game piracy isn't legally treated as theft to begin with. The underlying moral argument is nevertheless compelling. If you as a gamer can have the right to play a game that you've paid for revoked at any time, what is it that you actually own? The answer is, well, nothing. Not even the right to continue to play the game that you've bought should the licensor decide as much. This is why we've seen efforts like Stop Killing Games attempt to fight this industry standard. And I've made it clear that I agree with SKG and that my own moral stance towards video game ownership is that we, the consumers, should have the right to own what we've paid for, and that modern licensing structure is predatory by design. Piracy, then, in this moral framework is like an act of rebellion, isn't it? It may be unlawful, and it is something that organizations like SKG wish to distance themselves from as much as possible. But fundamentally, the moral foundation is similar. The narrative surrounding so-called piracy and illegal distribution, or for that matter, fan games and remakes, is that it is all fundamentally pro-consumer, and potentially even the moral choice in light of industry greed. This stance tends to be the prevailing stance amongst gamers in Europe, in the United States, in Brazil, all throughout the Western world, really. But where does this morality come from exactly? What do I mean? Well, we in the West have this prevailing understanding that intellectual property rights, copyrights, trademarks, and even patents have limits, and that those limits exist for our benefit not just as consumers, but as a society. And when an IP holder pushes against the limits of those rights, it is our responsibility to push back and argue against that pushing of the boundaries. But where does that come from? Well, let's go back in time to observe the context. Our legal history lesson then begins where most of the modern world's problems begin, in England.
What's PE-wet, mate? What's PE-wet?
In the year 1740, the Court of Chancery of England established a doctrine called fair abridgment. The case was Giles v. Wilcox, and the Right Honourable Philip York, 1st Earl of Hardwicke, decided therein that an abridged or a condensed and reorganized work could be considered a so-called true abridgment, and that such true abridgments constitute new works rather than violations of copyright. The RHPYE of H then distinguished those true abridgments from so-called colorable shortenings, which he described as disguised copies merely pretending to be new. If we abstract this thinking then for a moment, what we have is a distinction between the permissible transformative fan work and the copycat substitutive product. Now, a century later, this foundational case law was then expanded upon in the United States in 1841, with the decision of Judge Joseph Story in Folsom v. Marsh. The facts of the case are as follows. A man named Jared Sparks had edited a 12-volume collection of George Washington's writings and papers published by Folsom, Wells, and Thurston. A different man, Reverend Charles Wentworth Upham, then produced his own 2-volume work, The Life of Washington in the form of an autobiography, published by the firm of one Bella Marsh. But Upham's book copied hundreds of pages of Washington's letters and papers from Sparks' earlier collection, upon which Folsom sues Marsh for quote-unquote piracy of copyright. Marsh, the defendant, argued that their work was a new and independent one. It was a different biography, arranged differently for a different purpose. It was, as per Giles v. Wilcox, a permissible transformative work. Right? Wrong. Judge Story disagreed. He held that the copy letters were protected, and that too much protected material was used, thus making the use not fair. And in so doing, Judge Story established a balancing test. To determine if a use was fair, courts should consider the following. Number 1, the nature and objects of the selections made. Number 2, the quantity and value of the materials used. And number 3, the degree in which the use may prejudice the sale or diminish the profits or supersede the objects of the original work. If you've watched my previous videos, this might all sound kind of familiar to you. This test was the progenitor to the 4-factor test for fair use that is still in use today, which was codified in the Copyright Act of 1976. But Mooney, I can hear you saying, what's so important about this history exactly? Why couldn't we just have gone right to the Copyright Act of 1976 like all the other times we've talked about fair use? Well, there are 2 interesting observations to make here that specifically pertain to why we in the West have this adversarial relationship with intellectual property. The first is the origin of fair use in IP as we understand it in British common law. Most of the world uses civil law. In most of Europe, law is an undergraduate degree and you don't argue against another lawyer, you argue your case to a judge. In the Anglosphere, including the UK and the US, practicing law requires a doctorate, and you argue against another lawyer in front of a judge. This adversarial relationship is baked into American law. The same American law which produced Judge Story's decision in Folsom v. Marsh, which legal scholar Lyman Ray Patterson called, and I quote, the worst intellectual property opinion ever written. Why? Well, because in Patterson's view, Story mutated copyright from a limited public bargain into something more akin to private property. Copyright became less like a temporary monopoly society tolerates in order to encourage culture and development as it was originally conceived, and more like a fenced estate, where the owner has the right to chase off trespassers. Which is to say, the expansion of copyright as a burden upon societal creativity and the ostensible workaround to that burden come from the same place. And so, when fair use then expands into a proper affirmative defense in the Copyright Act of 1976, it brings with it all of this baggage, and with it, this societal understanding of how copyright and derivative works should be. In the United States, intellectual property rights are vague and adversarial in nature. Remember that private property problem identified by Patterson? Let's talk real property for a moment. Imagine a landlord who considers a tenant a squatter and wants to evict them. There's all kinds of nuances and rules, right? And ultimately, this system puts one party against the other and they fight it out on the legal battlefield. This is how we developed our understanding of IP rights in the United States, and thus it makes sense that American gamers are pro-piracy the way Level 5 might see it, or in the gamer's eyes, merely pro-rights. The rights that you have are always fought for and against, and as I've covered in previous videos, the entire field of IP is a nebulous mess that is littered with legal landmines. In the far future of IP law, there is only war. And as I've covered before in even other videos, we Americans basically forced the rest of the world to comply with our intellectual property laws for our benefit, after we became the global economic hegemon. As such, our adversarial, unclear, nebulous, and almost predatory intellectual property laws became the standard in Europe, in Brazil, and any country which has signed the TRIPS agreement, which is like every single country except North Korea. And no, that doesn't count, that's Western Sahara, look, don't worry about it. To quote one Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank, TRIPS imposed on the entire world the dominant intellectual property regime in the United States and Europe as it is today. I believe that the way that intellectual property regime has evolved is not good for the United States and the EU, but even more, I believe it is not in the interest of the developing countries. Which is the understatement of the century, but if you're interested in that topic, I encourage you to watch the whole video I made on it. Again, to reiterate then, we in the West have this long baked-in adversarial, conflict-oriented understanding of intellectual property, and thus we have the tendency to fight for our fan works. And we must, or we will lose them. The side that doesn't fight in this system loses its rights. But what about Japan? Japan is a signatory of TRIPS too, right? So why is the relationship there between rights holders and fans almost cooperative? International treaties are amongst the most powerful laws of the land anywhere they're implemented. In the United States, a treaty is second only to the Constitution in the legal hierarchy. But generally speaking, when a country signs a treaty, the implementation of that treaty is up to them. With TRIPS, for example, the treaty doesn't tell you that you have to put this exact clause word for word into your law. Instead, it gives you these minimal provisions that you must adhere to lest you be in violation of the treaty. You can choose to implement those provisions however you like, or in the case of TRIPS, even make them more strict. After all, the United States isn't worried about IP holders or corporations having too many rights. It's only a concern if the consumer has too many rights. We can't have regular people cutting into corporate profits, right? But if you want to protect your corporations even more, well, we are cool with that. And Japan did exactly that. The Japanese implementation of these American laws was substantially more strict. And one of the things that the Japanese purposefully did not implement into TRIPS compliant IP law was any kind of American-style fair use. Now, fair use is a strictly American term, but it kind of exists in other forms in other signatory countries. In the EU, for example, there isn't this vague fair use doctrine, but a wide array of acceptable and enumerated uses, such as parody, quotation, criticism, and pastiche, not to mention various other consumer protections besides. Japan has some enumerated protections as well, but most are very limited in scope, very narrow, and very strict. There's much less ambiguity here, and while that does expand the rights of IP holders even further, giving them even more control, what it also does is it makes IP holders less afraid. There's less of an adversarial push and pull because the adversary, the consumer, the people, are so weak that they don't actually pose a meaningful threat. Fan creators in Japan lack any kind of broad legal defense. The shogun has confiscated everyone's swords. This in turn creates, ironically, a cooperative system, where in the West, if you want to make a fan work, you are incentivized by law to fight for your fan work and your rights, and the IP holder has to pick and choose their battles. In Japan, there is no battle. The fans know the limits of what is and isn't okay. The corporations aren't afraid to allow a little intrusion into their borders, the occasional squatting, because they know the law is so pro-landlord, so to speak. Imagine that if you were a tenant, or for that matter a squatter, living for free on the outskirts of a landlord's property. If the landlord turns a blind eye and allows you to live there, when the squatter from the other landlord's property comes asking you to fight your landlord, what incentive do you have to do that? You instead defend your landlord because you have a home and you don't need to fight for it, as long as you respect the rules. Now look, if you didn't respect the rules, if you chose to fight and carve out a space for yourself, could you potentially get more? Yes, the system still has some adversarial qualities baked in, of course, but the risks are much, much greater, and your tools to do so far fewer. Remember, no swords. And worse yet, you could destabilize the status quo for all of the other squatters, in that danger that the landlord could see you as ungrateful and evict you all, and that the law would offer you no protection if so, means that everyone is incentivized to stick together to protect the landlord. The fan community thereby polices itself out of necessity and makes sure nobody ruins the good thing they have going for them, including, but not limited to, pesky foreigners. It's like IP feudalism, and to the Japanese, better the king they know in the fields that grow than the nanban at the gate. Let's make something very clear here. Japanese fans aren't corporate bootlickers. What the Japanese fans are doing is that they are protecting a fragile ecosystem of tolerance. The Japanese fans understand that their legal system does not allow them any room to maneuver. They understand that their fan works and their fan comics and their fan games are all subject to their cooperation with IP holders, and that there is no realistic adversarial competitive alternative to that cooperation. They are incentivized by law to fight back against anyone trying to rock the boat and ruin a good thing for everyone. Likewise, Western fans are not simply entitled pirates. Westerners are reacting to a real failure of access, preservation, ownership, and localization by doing what their legal systems incentivize and even encourage them to do, which is to be an adversary and fight. Cooperation between fans and IP holders is largely discouraged in the Western legal IP battlefield because if you don't fight for your rights, you will lose them. If you then are a Western fan hoping to engage with a Japanese IP, you must understand the rules of engagement. Not just for your sake as a creator, but for the sake of all the other creators around you. You must understand the difference between tribute and substitution. fan art, criticism, parodies, mods, spiritual successors, and original works inspired by beloved IPs are culturally and legally safer. Rebuilding a beloved commercial game from the ground up? Well, that's not as safe, and it has never been safe, not for your work and not for the other fan creators who you might impact with that decision. But I also understand who I'm talking to here. You want to fight, and at some point, you will. There will be another fan game remake someday, and there will be a takedown, and there will be another drama around it. This isn't a threat. This isn't even a prediction, really. This is simply what happens when love has nowhere lawful to go. And believe me, come hell or high water, love will find a way. I've been your host, Mooney. I hope you enjoyed this shorter legal video. Moon Channel donates 10% of its gross income to charity, so I sincerely appreciate your patience with this video's sponsor, World of Warships. A special thanks to co-creator Larita, to the fine folks at Silva Gunner for the music, and to our dearly beloved patrons, without whom none of this would be possible. And thank you, as always, as ever, for tuning in to Moon Channel.